Napoleon Bonaparte was a man built for command with nowhere left to command, a strategist born for empire walking in a world ready to bury him. But then everything changed. The wind stopped, the air turned heavy, the horizon shimmered like heat on stone, and the world he knew dissolved. When the haze cleared, there were no English uniforms, no French tricolors, no remnants of the age he came from. Before him stretched marble columns rising unbroken into the sun, banners dyed in Tyrian purple, legions drilling in perfect formation on open fields, and voices speaking a Latin he understood not from books, but from history itself. Rome, not the ruins he had visited in his youth, not the idea, not the memory, but Rome alive, breathing, powerful, vulnerable, flawed. The year was 395 AD, and the Western Empire stood on the edge of collapse without realizing it. Napoleon stood at its doorstep with nothing but the knowledge of every mistake it was about to make. He did not announce himself. A fallen emperor arriving in Rome would be treated as a madman at best, a threat at worst. Instead, he claimed to be a minor officer from a provincial auxiliary, a foreigner whose accent was odd, but whose eyes betrayed calculation. Rome kept such men at a distance, but war makes exceptions. Soon he found himself among legates and centurions who viewed him with suspicion, until one day a Gothic raiding party struck a remote frontier garrison, and it should have been a massacre, but the garrison held. More than that, it broke the attackers with unnatural efficiency, striking at flanks instead of holding rigid lines, rotating troops between front and rear ranks, using reserve cavalry not as a last resort, but as the deciding blow. That victory was Napoleon's first seed of power, planted quietly, without fanfare, without statues or titles. Soldiers remembered his orders even when they forgot his name. They began to ask questions. How did he know the enemy would come at dawn? Why did he place archers diagonally instead of behind the infantry? Why were his supply wagons so light and fast compared to the bloated Roman trains? And most importantly, how did he win so easily? Whispers spread, an outsider, a strategist unlike any Rome had seen in generations. Some called him arrogant, some called him brilliant, but the legions called him something else entirely. Imperator, not in public, not yet, only in quiet moments when the campfires burned low and men spoke honestly. Rome was touched by a sickness of tradition, not in birthright or religion, but in habit. Every mistake was repeated because it had always been done that way. The Senate clung to the past, generals clung to outdated tactics, and the people clung to stories instead of strategy. Napoleon saw all of this and felt something unfamiliar: opportunity. Rome was weak, but not dead. It was tired, but not broken. It was not a fallen empire, it was an unused weapon, waiting for someone to pick it up. When he entered Rome itself, escorted by a cohort assigned to present him to the emperor, he moved slowly, absorbing everything like a man walking through a dream made solid. The city was full of contradictions. Streets paved in stone and marble carried carts held together with rope. Magnificent temples stood beside collapsing apartments. 1,000 statues of past emperors watched 1,000 citizens who no longer believed in the future. But beneath all that decay, Rome still felt alive. Rome still felt like destiny. In the Senate, Napoleon spoke carefully. He did not mock Roman tradition, but he questioned its lack of evolution. He described a treasury stabilized through a single standardized currency rather than provincial minting. He explained that armies could be trained year-round, not only during campaigns, using smaller, faster legions instead of massive, slow-moving forces. He spoke about logistics, rotation, and intelligence networks. Everything he said was met with polite nods and private scorn. The Senate believed experience was something inherited rather than earned. They did not understand that the greatest difference between Napoleon and them was not that he had lived in the future, but that he knew how to learn from the past. So he did what he had always done. He went to the people who mattered most: soldiers. If Rome respected anything, it was victory. He reorganized training, introduced small unit drills, designed equipment modifications using lighter alloy mixes, and restructured marching camps into defendable modular layouts with speed of assembly as the priority. He believed that war was not won by courage alone, but by calculation. And he taught Rome the mathematics of survival. Every battle he influenced became more efficient. Every campaign cost fewer lives. Every legionary began to see a future worth fighting for, not just a salary worth collecting. And gradually, resistance turned to curiosity, curiosity to respect, and respect to a dangerous kind of loyalty. But success creates fear, and fear creates enemies. Senators called him a foreign agitator. Generals accused him of undermining Roman tradition. The emperor admired him, but worried. Power in Rome was delicate. Too much brilliance in one man could become a threat greater than any barbarian army. Napoleon understood their fear. He had seen it before in Europe. He had seen men resent genius simply because it made their failures undeniable. But he also knew something Rome did not. If Rome did not change, it would be gone within a century. He had already seen the future, and he had no intention of watching history repeat itself. Then the moment came. A massive Visigothic force swept toward Italy, larger than any previous incursion. The Senate panicked. The emperor hesitated. Rome was too slow to respond and too arrogant to admit it. Napoleon requested command. The Senate refused. He asked again. They argued. Time was running out. So he did something that would become legend. He assembled a force himself, not with legions issued by decree, but with men who volunteered to follow him. Veterans, auxiliaries, engineers, even farmers who believed in what he was building. They followed not because of Rome, not because of law, but because of the one thing Rome had forgotten how to inspire: belief. In the shadow of the Alps, he faced the Visigoths. Their numbers dwarfed his. Their confidence was absolute. They expected another Roman disaster, a repeat of the same old defensive formations and slow supply lines. What they encountered instead was a hybrid of two worlds: Roman discipline fused with Napoleonic strategy, feigned retreats that lured cavalry into spear traps, supply wagons disguised as weak points but armed inside like mobile forts, massed artillery, not stone throwers, but compact torsion engines arranged like batteries, firing in coordinated volleys instead of sporadic launches. Napoleon broke them, not with luck, but with foresight. Instead of chasing glory, he destroyed morale. Instead of defending Rome, he made Rome terrifying again. When the dust settled, messengers rode ahead of him to the capital. Rome expected defeat. Instead, it received something it had not felt in decades, a victory so absolute that even the gods seemed to take notice. The emperor publicly honored Napoleon. The Senate had no choice but to applaud. The people chanted his name, and from that moment forward, power shifted. A new Rome had begun, and its true emperor just hadn't been crowned yet. Napoleon's return to Rome after the Visigothic defeat changed everything. Though not in the loud and dramatic way history often describes revolutions, Rome did not erupt into celebration. There were no fireworks or triumphant parades beyond what was necessary. Instead, the transformation began in quiet places, in whispered conversations beneath the shadow of marble archways, inside barracks where young soldiers tried to imitate his formations using stones and dice, and in the small alleys where merchants argued whether his reforms would save or destroy the city. Rome was always obsessed with symbols, but Napoleon was obsessed with systems. He believed no nation could endure on pride alone. So while the Senate debated statues and titles, he focused on grain routes, taxation reforms, and water distribution. "A hungry citizen is not loyal," he said once to a praetorian who questioned why he cared so deeply about something as mundane as sewer maintenance. Rome did not fall from lack of enemies. It fell from lack of understanding what truly holds power together. Politics in Rome was not a debate. It was a battlefield disguised with silk and ceremony. Laws were weapons, alliances traps, and reputation both shield and sword. The Senate tolerated Napoleon only as long as they feared the people admired him more. Some believed he was a necessary evil, better to use him while he remained useful. Others believed he was the next Sulla, a tyrant waiting for his opening. And somewhere in the quiet back rooms, over wine and flickering oil lamps, letters were written to provincial generals offering wealth in exchange for loyalty if they ever found the need to remove the foreigner from the picture. Napoleon knew all of this. He did not hate them for it. In his own world, he had seen exactly the same patterns. Brilliant men replaced by fearful ones, revolutions devouring their own architects, nations too proud to change until they became lessons instead of warnings. He looked upon Rome not as a conqueror, but as a man staring at a genius, slowly drowning in its own traditions. While politics swirled like a storm behind stone walls, Napoleon formed new alliances outside the Senate. He sought out craftsmen, mathematicians, engineers, and foreign-born officers who had been denied Roman prestige due to their birthplace. He met with Egyptian scholars who preserved ancient knowledge and with Syrian architects who understood structural techniques long forgotten in the West. He even spoke with Christian bishops, not because he shared their beliefs, but because he understood what they represented. A movement Rome could neither control nor suppress forever. Instead of fighting ideas, he studied them. Instead of ruling through fear, he began to rule through curiosity, an approach so alien to Roman politics that many didn't know whether to admire or fear it. It was during one of these quieter efforts that an idea took shape, a museum of the world, a place where Roman achievements and foreign knowledge could coexist, not as trophies of conquest, but as instruments of progress. Rome had temples and palaces, but it did not have institutions built for learning. Napoleon imagined a hall where maps would line the walls, showing not only Rome's dominion, but the lands beyond, places known neither to Caesar nor Augustus. He imagined models of siege engines beside astronomical tables, Greek manuscripts copied alongside engineering diagrams of aqueducts redesigned for efficiency. Some of the Senate mocked the idea. What value was there in gathering useless information? Napoleon only smiled. If Rome had spent half as much time learning as it did conquering, he replied, it would not be defending itself from every direction. Yet for all the progress, tension grew. Rome's old guard feared what they could not control. Generals resented being outshined by a man who had not risen through their ranks. Even the emperor, grateful yet uneasy, began to distance himself. Rome was a place where loyalty shifted with opportunity, and opportunity shifted like sand in the Colosseum. Napoleon had won battles, earned respect, and shaped policy, but he had not yet taken the throne. And as whispers of coronation began to surface in taverns and barracks, the Senate realized the unthinkable was no longer hypothetical. It was inevitable. The question was no longer, will he become emperor? But when? And what will Rome become afterward? Some imagined a new golden age. Others imagined tyranny. But only Napoleon truly understood the truth. That power alone could not save Rome. What mattered was whether the empire could learn to evolve, whether it could become something new without losing itself. He had changed battles, yes. He had changed laws. But the spirit of Rome, proud, stubborn, brilliant, self-destructive, still stood on the edge of its own extinction. Even he could not know whether his reforms were salvation or merely a delay in the inevitable collapse. And yet, late at night, standing on the same hill where centuries earlier Augustus had sworn to preserve the Republic, even as he ended it, Napoleon allowed himself a small hope. Maybe history was not a straight line. Maybe fate was not fixed. Maybe Rome, this Rome, his Rome, could become what it was always meant to be. Not an empire of walls and borders, but an empire of ideas, built not on conquest, but on purpose. He closed his eyes and listened to the distant sound of soldiers training in formation below, drilling in patterns no Roman commander before him had ever imagined. He listened to merchants unloading goods from ships, to bakers lighting their ovens before dawn, to children laughing in the streets of an ancient city reborn. For the first time since Waterloo, he did not feel like a defeated man. He felt like a man standing at the center of history, not its victim, but its author. The world had been rewritten once. Now it was time to rewrite Rome. The first battle he fought on Roman soil was not the largest, but it became legend due to what followed. A Visigoth warband was raiding borderlands, confident that Rome could not respond in time. The old Roman method would have been to mass legions, march slowly, and seek a single decisive clash. Napoleon refused. Instead, he split his force into 3 rapid-moving columns and used scouts, not merely as lookouts, but as a living network of intelligence, relaying enemy movement with signal fires and mounted couriers. He studied the terrain, not as an obstacle, but as a weapon. He positioned a thin, visible line of infantry in the open, baiting the Visigoths into a charge. But hidden behind a ridge, shielded from sight, he placed cavalry prepared not to pursue, but to strike the rear. When the Goths advanced, The Roman line intentionally bent backward, not breaking, but absorbing impact like a hinge. Then Napoleon unleashed his cavalry crosswise, severing the enemy advance like scissors closing over cloth. It was the first time Roman soldiers had seen a feigned retreat used intentionally, and when the dust settled, they stared not only at a victory, but at a new language of war. But that encounter, impressive as it was merely a demonstration. The true test came later, not at the fringes, but at Rome's heart. The Visigoths, now under unified leadership, returned with an army many times larger. They marched with certainty, believing Rome hollow, its armies slow, its cities full of fear. Napoleon did not wait behind walls. He moved to intercept, not recklessly, but precisely. His mind reassembled thousands of years of military failure and instinctively corrected them. He shortened supply lines. He formed mixed-unit battle groups, combining infantry, cavalry, archers, and engineers into self-sufficient blocks that could fight without central orders. He abandoned the heavy square formation Rome had relied upon for centuries and replaced it with semi-flexible wings that could contract or expand like lung tissue. Where Roman armies once fought like a wall, Napoleon made them fight like water, flowing, reshaping, trapping. And then came the moment that changed everything. On a plain outside Mediolanum, Napoleon committed a maneuver Rome had never been capable of performing. A double envelopment executed with precise timing. His center held firm, just long enough for his flanks to sweep inward, not by brute force, but by calculated speed and discipline. It was Hannibal at Cannae, but perfected. The Visigothic cavalry attempted to retreat and found only fire, not from Napoleonic cannons, but from oil-soaked trenchworks set alight by signal. He had reinvented artillery not through explosives, but through engineering, creating portable torsion engines arranged like indirect fire batteries, launching flaming projectiles in timed arcs that boxed the enemy in. For the first time in centuries, Rome saw not survival, but domination. The enemy was not beaten. They were erased. After that, the legions did not simply respect Napoleon. They followed him like a myth, still in the process of being written. Officers kept journals describing tactics they could not fully comprehend, but trusted instinctively because they worked. Soldiers whispered that he had seen wars not yet invented. They were not wrong. In the silence after victory, Napoleon looked across the battlefield and felt something too complicated for triumph, a strange sadness that history was repeating itself in a different language. He knew that every victory brought him closer to the throne, and every advancement narrowed the line between leadership and tyranny. Yet he also knew that Rome, if left as it was, would die. He was not changing Rome for himself. He was changing it because no one else could. Rome responded in its usual way, half awe, half panic. The Senate was divided between those who wanted to worship him and those who wanted him dead. The emperor feared that giving Napoleon more command meant giving him the empire itself. Ambassadors from Eastern Rome watched him closely, already calculating whether he was a threat or an opportunity. And beneath the marble floors of villas and the sanctuary of temples, conspiracies began to form. A poisoned cup, a forged decree, a quiet disappearance in the night. There were many ways to end a legend before it became unstoppable. Yet while politics churned like black water beneath the surface, Napoleon reshaped daily life in ways that no emperor before him ever dreamed. He reorganized the grain fleets so bread became reliable again, not a luxury, but a guarantee. He commissioned new aqueduct repairs using improved engineering techniques borrowed from centuries that had not yet happened. He standardized weights and measures so merchants no longer cheated customers. He convinced generals to adopt regional recruitment so citizens saw their army as their own instead of a distant institution. Rome began slowly, cautiously, to believe it had a future. At night, Napoleon wandered the palatial terraces in silence, watching torchlight flicker across statues of emperors who had conquered and died and been forgotten. He wondered what would happen if Rome did not fall, if philosophy continued to grow instead of being buried in monasteries, if science was nurtured instead of suppressed, if industry sparked not in England in the 1700s, but in Rome in the 400s. What would the world become if Rome survived Long enough to evolve? What if the Renaissance came 1,000 years early? What if electricity was discovered in Alexandria instead of Paris? What if steam engines pulled carts along Roman roads? What if the world leapt forward not through collapse, but through continuity? He did not see himself as a conqueror anymore. He saw himself as a hinge in time, a place where worlds could turn in different directions. He sometimes prayed, not to the Roman gods, not even to the god of his own era, but to the universe itself. Let me not repeat my mistakes. Let me build instead of break. Let this empire become a warning to no one. As Rome transformed, so did its enemies. Some fell into submission, others evolved. The Franks began to unify earlier, fearing a reborn Rome. The Huns took longer to advance because they faced resistance more organized than any they expected. The Eastern Empire became cautious rather than arrogant, now forced to negotiate with a Rome that could no longer be exploited. Even the church changed. Christianity spread differently, not as the religion of suffering in the ruins of a dead empire, but as a voice negotiating with power instead of replacing it. Napoleon did not intend to reshape theology, but every choice bends history beyond intention. And still, the shadow of imperial power drew closer. Soldiers began calling him Imperator openly. The people began carving his likeness beside Caesar and Augustus. Even the Senate understood that resisting might destroy Rome more surely than surrendering to change. Yet Napoleon hesitated. He had worn a crown before and watched it become his prison. He knew he could ascend, but he also knew the throne had killed every man who sat on it one way or another. Rome demanded sacrifice. It had taken Caesar's life. It had taken Augustus's freedom. It had taken every soul who believed they could control it. If Napoleon became emperor, would he save the empire, or would the empire consume him the way it consumed everyone? These questions haunted him more than any battlefield. Victory required clarity. Rule required doubt. And so he stood between two destinies, the future he could create and the collapse he was sent here to prevent. Rome waited. The world held its breath. History leaned forward. And Napoleon understood that the moment was coming when he would have to decide, would he become Rome's salvation or its final emperor? The Senate, suspicious yet intrigued by Napoleon's meteoric influence, continued to debate his rapid reforms. Some believed he had been sent by the gods, others whispered he was the gods' punishment for Roman arrogance. Napoleon listened to their warnings, but his mind drifted often to the great empires that would one day rise and fall. Spain, Prussia, Britain, and how Rome, the greatest of all, had still managed to crumble. He remembered reading about it as a child, the melancholy weight of knowing that even giants collapse. Now, he had torn that page from history and was rewriting it with his own hand. Still, he could feel the clock ticking inside his mind. He didn't know how long he would remain in this era, if time itself might recoil and undo him. It kept him awake late at night, staring into the oil lamp's quiet flame, imagining Josephine's voice, her laughter, and the chill of knowing she was centuries away, forever unreachable. In those hours, Rome was silent, and the city felt like a coin balanced on its edge, ready to fall one way or the other. War arrived like it always did, on the sound of hooves, rumors, and frightened merchants. A coalition of Germanic tribes had crossed the Rhine, believing Rome weak and scattered. It was a mistake Napoleon welcomed, because war was where he could speak a language even senators could understand. His reforms had included drilling legions in new formations, borrowing from his own future campaigns. He replaced outdated rigid squares with hybrid columns, fast-moving, precise units capable of independent initiative. He introduced standardized signals using brass horns and even rough experimental maps drawn to something close to scale. The first major engagement took place in the flat fields near Mogontiacum, beneath a sky smeared red with dusk. The Germanic warriors outnumbered the Romans nearly 2-1, fighting in loose but furious waves, screaming their ancestors' names. The old Roman commanders urged the standard phalanx, but Napoleon shook his head. He ordered his front line to bait the advancing center, then suddenly pull back, creating a corridor into the Roman formations. The Germanic warriors surged in, believing they had broken the line, but the corridor narrowed, and the cohorts on each side swung shut like a steel trap. Napoleon had created an early form of an encirclement maneuver centuries before Cannae, or rather centuries after, depending on how one counted time. The enemy found themselves compressed and unable to swing their massive axes. Napoleonic artillery did not exist here, but instead he used heavy cavalry charges like mobile cannon blasts, breaking morale through kinetic devastation. When the fighting ended, the field was a quiet sea of bodies, mist rising like incense. The Romans walked the field in disbelief. They had won battles before, but not like this. Not with such terrifying precision, not with so few Roman casualties. Napoleon rode alone to the river afterwards, his horse steaming in the cold air. He stared into the water and whispered, "In my time, victory was expected of me. Here, it feels like a miracle." A soldier nearby overheard, and by dawn, the rumor had spread. Napoleon spoke with river spirits, with gods, with the soul of Rome itself. The myth was growing larger than the man, and though he did not encourage it, he did not stop it either. Rome obeyed power, but more importantly, it obeyed stories. He knew that better than anyone. Everyday life changed slowly but visibly. Bakers now paid wages in coin that held stable value, because Napoleon had minted a new currency backed by controlled grain reserves, laws, and silver taxation. Farmers received state loans to expand production. Roads, once crumbling, were rebuilt with standardized stonework to support faster military and commercial travel. Carpenters learned from designs Napoleon roughly sketched from memory, early concepts of trusses and arches that would not exist for centuries. Public bathhouses now required civic registration, not for control, but for the first census that counted people, not just property. Rome was beginning to feel modern in strange and uneven ways, like the future growing inside the bones of the past. But power always invites fear. There were those, silent in corridors, who believed Napoleon would not stop at restoring Rome. He would crown himself king. They plotted, and one night, a senator named Cassian stood before him in a private atrium, confessing an assassination attempt before striking. Napoleon did not flinch. Instead, he asked Cassian a question no emperor had ever asked a traitor. "Do you fear me, or do you fear Rome becoming something you do not recognize?" The question stunned him. Cassian's dagger shook. He dropped it and left without another word. The next day, Napoleon passed a decree, not for punishment, but for representation, creating a proto-constitutional body in which senators would serve alongside military officials and elected regional magistrates. Rome gasped. He had not seized power, he had diffused it, but the effect was the same. His influence ran everywhere. Yet the dreams continued. Sometimes he dreamed of Waterloo, of smoke and mud and rain, of defeats so bitter that waking up in Rome almost felt like resurrection. He wondered if the universe had offered him a second chance, not to win the same war, but to win a greater one, the war against inevitability. And the world beyond Rome changed too. Envoys from Parthia brought gifts instead of threats. Trade routes extended so far east that silk, once worth the weight of gold, now appeared in modest households. Greek philosophers flocked to Rome, debating alongside early engineers about the nature of time, about whether history could bend. One evening, after listening to a heated argument about destiny and free will, Napoleon said quietly, "Perhaps the past is not fixed, but waiting for the right hand to guide it." His eyes were tired, his voice was soft, but in that moment, every man in the room believed him. Late that night, he walked through the forum alone, his footsteps echoing between marble columns. He thought of Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal, men he had studied, admired, surpassed. He wondered if any of them had ever felt this strange loneliness and the burden of shaping a world no one else could yet see. He whispered to the darkness, "Is this what it means to rule? Never to rest, only to build?" Sometimes he even allowed himself to imagine the future, not the one he had left behind, but the future that might now emerge from this Rome, a Rome with universities centuries early. And so, as torches burn low against the marble pillars and a quiet wind slips through Rome's ancient streets, the emperor who carries the memory of gunpowder and republics, of revolutions not yet born and futures not yet written, now shapes an empire that has risen twice. Whether history will thank him or fear him, no one can say. But for now, Rome stands unbroken, its fate rewritten by a single man who once lost everything and found a second chance in the ashes of the past.